Hey everyone, and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined here in the second week of our social distancing. I am joined at a distance by Scott Nelson. Hello, sir.
What's up, man?
Bailey Perkins. How are you?
I am good. Hello, everybody.
And guest co-host this week, friend of the pod, previous guest and previous board member, Effie Rorke.
Hi, everybody.
I was just coming live all the way from Maine.
Yes.
We wanted to have a Mainer on the show today to help explain what the outbreak looks like across the country. Also, Effie is always an Oklahoman at heart, I think it's fair to say, and stays in the loop on Oklahoma politics and I think offers a fresh perspective. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And I will say that in Maine, it's important that you're not a Mainer unless your ancestors came on the Mayflower. So
Really?
Yeah, I will never be a Mainer. So I'm just visiting as far as they're concerned.
We visited Maine once, and they told us something similar. They were like, "Yeah, you can say you're from here if you're like maybe third or fourth generation, but definitely no earlier than that.
Yep.
Unless you're living on land that your family has owned for a minimum of 100 years, you're not from Maine."
Yep.
What's funny about that is because in Oklahoma, so many people in Oklahoma like really do live on land their family's owned for 100 years, but they're only the second owners, right? Like,
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
All right. Well, let's start with just like kind of a brief personal check-in. How's everybody holding up?
Man, this is weird, right? Like this whole situation, it's just it's different and strange. And I honestly, from like just my own personal experience and then talking to other folks, I don't think it's really set in yet for a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe more than last week, but not enough people have taken it seriously.
Not as much as next week, I anticipate.
I find myself kind of fluctuating between, am I overreacting? Am I underreacting? And, so much staying off of social media helps because there's so many extremes of like, this is the apocalypse and it's really bad and going to get worse. And then like, well, testing's really low. And so maybe it's not that bad. So I find myself kind of like swinging between these wild feelings all day long.
Or testing is really, really low, so maybe it's so much worse than we think it is right now.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time getting a hold on like how I'm actually feeling about it, other than just general anxiety.
Yeah, or just like going to sleep and then waking up hoping that Ashton Kutcher will pop up saying we've been punked. So
yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's tough because there's so many numbers coming at us about infections, hospitalizations, deaths, and it varies so widely state to state, country to country, and it's really hard to, I think for most folks, I mean myself included, to know how to peg where we're at, right? Even I saw someone did a bunch of graphs like for every state and the number of infections, but the scale of the graph was different for every state, right? So a tall bar could be 30 tests, it could be 300 tests. I was like, well, that's a huge difference. Like we need some kind of standardization across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of one of those deals like this is, I think this is more true in the age of social media than at any other time. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. But like everybody's like, we've gone from being like armchair, political strategists to like now everybody's an armchair epidemiologist to like,
yeah, So many hot takes and it's kind of exhausting.
And I mean, it's important to remember even, I think we're going to talk about like a couple numbers here in a minute that are, I think, illustrative, but it's like modeling how these kinds of things spread through populations is extraordinarily complicated. Like people literally write dissertations on how you model this kind of a disease outbreak. And so anybody who says that like, oh, it's gonna happen like X, Y, or Z is unless they are in fact a bona fide public health expert.
They wouldn't say it though.
Well, right. Right. Like,
well, so, quick update. I'm sure most of our listeners know this, but we're recording this on Friday, March 20th at about 3:00 in the afternoon. So as of now, both the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University and many other universities here in our state and across the country have announced they're going online only for the remainder of the semester. I think a bunch of people have graduations that are postponed. We expect the State Department of Education will likely go ahead and push the rest of the school year, just say it's a wash, and try to do some kind of distance education where they can. But this really may be that spring break is the end of the semester, which bumps. I mean, there's a chance they could go into the summer, right? But it also has impacts on standardized testing and all kinds of stuff across the country. I think it is important to note that school meals will still be served. Whoever made the note on our show notes here, thank you. That Superintendent Hofmeister has waived all state testing for the school year. I wish I had read that a minute ago.
Yeah, well, the federal government allowed states to make that decision, and Superintendent Hofmeister announced that yesterday. That it's not an easy decision, but it's an important decision for our students, especially because so many of them are probably stressed out in this moment of trying to figure out what's going on, how to stay safe. Are they even going to have school? I don't think it's fair to put that burden on students, and even teachers who would have to figure out how to prepare their students in this time for the test, even though many of them have moved to online models. So I think it's a good move from Superintendent Hofmeister to let those go for.
Yeah. Scott, can I ask, to whatever extent you feel comfortable saying, what's the mood like in the medical community?
Pretty stressful, I think. I will say, like, I've had just a ton of people. Many of whom, all of whom are on this podcast right now, have reached out to me and been like, hey man, like, how's it going? Friends have said like, hey, we hope you're staying safe. The truth is, so I work in an outpatient setting, meaning I see patients in a clinic. I don't work in a hospital or an intensive care unit. And so far for us, what has been difficult is that the volume of actual people that we're seeing is actually a little bit down this week, right? Lots of people are canceling doctor's appointments that they had because they're wanting to stay away. So that's one thing, but there are so many phone calls, right? Like, because obviously everybody has heard about this now. Everybody's worried about it. Lots of people think that they have it. Lots of people probably do have it, and they're wanting to be tested. They want to know if they should come see the doctor. And so answering those questions and the sheer number of people that we're having to tell, like, no, don't come to the office, like, stay home, because if you come to the office, we're probably not going to test you because A, you may have it, and B, we have a limited number of testing supplies. And so we have to try and reserve those for patients where, like, knowing whether this is what you have or not is an important part of your treatment plan. Does that make sense?
Right.
And there can be a whole host of reasons why that would be the case. So kind of trying to invent new protocols on the fly, that's been really tough, right? Because like hospital systems and doctors' offices, we got protocols for fires and tornadoes and earthquakes and disasters and snowstorms and tornadoes and whatever else you can imagine. But there's not really a protocol, at least as far as I'm aware, for like every hospital and every clinic being hit with the same emergency at the same time, right? Like when that happens, your backup systems can't be your backup systems anymore because they're dealing with their own stuff. So I would say, in terms of like how we're doing, like, we're all wearing masks all the time and gloves all the time and trying to make sure we don't get sick and don't get other people sick. And there's definitely a high level of stress there. But at present, I don't think the situation in Oklahoma City is like the situation that we're seeing in, Seattle and New York, or certainly not overseas. And the goal is to make sure that it doesn't get there.
Yeah.
That was a really long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of my deal. So,
I mean, as we kind of said, the state's got a critical shortage of tests and testing supplies. I just talked to a colleague on the phone right before we started recording who said that one of his relatives is older, like in their 60s, has cold-like symptoms, flu, got worse and worse. They live in a rural area, went to the hospital, called the PCP, went to the hospital, tested for everything, said, nope, you don't have any of that. And they said, is it difficult to breathe? And she said, I don't know. And they said, okay, well, if it's not definitely yes, then we can't test you. So go home and just isolate and call us if it gets worse. And so she went home and she's like, I guess I don't have it. And he was like, no, you probably do have it. They just can't test you. So she's like, I'm going to Walmart. He's like, don't go to Walmart. Like, no, like this is not how it works.
And that's a struggle I think that a lot of us are having. And one thing I would emphasize, okay, we are telling people like, hey, if we don't have, if we're not going to test you, like you probably have it. If your doctor tells you that they think you probably have coronavirus, stay home, don't go anywhere, self-quarantine and isolate for 14 days. Please do not post on social media that you have tested positive for coronavirus. Like, because that's been happening a lot, is folks that actually haven't been swabbed are posting on social media and saying, I tested positive, I tested positive, I tested positive. And like right now, because we're in this very like critical kind of early phase where we're trying to get a sense of how widespread this disease is, we need to know who the true positives are, and we need to know who the true negatives are. And like, you probably have it, then self-isolate yourself and treat yourself like that. But please don't post on social media that you tested positive for coronavirus.
Scott, has there been any additional information about the folks who've recovered, whether they're immune now, or like, is it safe for them to be out and about in society?
So I think that the thought process is that probably if you got coronavirus this year, you probably can't get COVID-19 this year again. We don't know yet if this is like the flu, where you can get flu A in 2020 and maybe you won't get flu A in 2020 again, but you could get flu A again next year because it's a different kind of strain. We don't know that yet. I know that there are lots of labs that are actively working on answering that question. Like if you've gotten sick with the disease that we call COVID-19, can you get it again in the future? And we don't know the answer to that yet. But that's a critical question to answer in terms of vaccine development, right? Like, are we going to have a new vaccine for this thing every year? Or are we going to spend the next year and a half developing a vaccine and everybody gets it and then it's gone?
Be done, right? Yeah.
Yep.
I think as testing expands, we all expect that the number of cases will go up. I think that's important to say, right? And hopefully, like, this sounds weird, but hopefully we will see a dramatic increase in the number of cases, because that means a dramatic increase in the number of tests that are being performed. We expect that there are lots of people who are infected, or at least have it, right? And they're just haven't been tested yet. You might call this a surge. And I think, as we said last week, the Frontier has been doing some excellent coverage of this. As of today, there's been 49 confirmed positives in the state. However, I think altogether we've done 961 tests. 49 are positive. But there's still like 374 that are pending. So like almost a third of all the tests have not yet even come back yet. And so,
well, and of those that we know, Mayor Holt wrote on Twitter that 2/3 of those cases that we know of are in the Oklahoma City metro. And I think the way he's defining Oklahoma City metro includes Norman. So,
right. Yeah.
So especially those in highly populated areas have to even be more cautious.
But it's also an issue of timing when the test is, right? Isn't that what you were talking about maybe earlier, Scott, that, you have to have enough of the viral load to test positive. And so doing lots of tests, and even if they come back negative, doesn't necessarily mean those folks are in the clear.
Yeah, that's 100% true. The other thing to think about in terms of the way that the numbers are coming back is we have 49 positive tests. And I want to be really clear. I don't know the answer to this question, but one thing that matters is when those tests were done. Okay. So a lot of tests right now are being done at outside laboratories outside the state of Oklahoma, because we simply don't have the number of tests and the capacity here. So just with like transit time and travel time and running the assay, and that everybody in the country is trying to do this test, results are going to take some time to come back. Right. So this is not like a deal where, you're necessarily going to get test results like in 24 hours. So like we got 5 new positive results today. Were those tests done 2 days ago, 5 days ago, 10 days ago? Like where in the time course of this outbreak were those like what point in the time course of this outbreak do those positive tests represent? I don't know the answer to that, right? Because if it's 7 or 10 days ago, then that changes things.
Yeah. And we did have our first death that has been directly attributed to COVID-19. A man in Tulsa is 55, and certainly our condolences to his family, and thoughts are with them. All right. Any other comments about COVID-19 coronavirus situation?
I have one more. It's both relevant to the outbreak and to Oklahoma, which is that if you have not watched Pandemic yet on Netflix, you need to watch it. It's a docuseries, so it's real life. It came out before all of this happened.
I believe in 2017, right?
Yeah. And it follows these infectious disease specialists around the world as they're trying to track, what's going to be the next pandemic. And then lo and behold, here we are right in the middle of it. But the interesting thing about it is that it features a rural Oklahoma hospital, and really loops in some of the struggles that the state budget has faced, some of the decisions the state legislature has made in cutting funding so much in recent years. And it's just this one rural doctor in Oklahoma who's terrified of a flu outbreak. So if you're interested in that, that's definitely a great and very timely series on Netflix right now.
That's fascinating. Also, that reminded me of another thing that came out on Netflix. Yes, Bailey.
Joe Exotic came out too. I watched the first few episodes, and it is weird, wild stuff.
Right. That's my plan for this weekend.
What's it called? Like Tiger or something? What's the name of the series?
I don't know. It's right on the front page though of Netflix, and it is so much weirder than I thought it was going to be.
Well, for our listeners who may not know who Joe Exotic is, he owned a tiger safari in Yukon or Mustang, I believe it was Mustang, and also made a run, I guess you could call it, for governor. And so that's how a lot of people knew who Joe Exotic was, for both the safari park that he and for his run for governor. Couple of mistakes he made, and now he is in prison. So it's an interesting documentary. Definitely go check it out on Netflix.
When she says mistakes, she means murder for hire.
Yeah, just things like that.
Murder for hire of another big cat person in Florida. It's like the most over the top personalities you could imagine, these people.
So the only other thing, just to take it back to go back to the coronavirus before we leave the topic entirely. One thing that I was going to throw out, and this is not me trying to be an armchair epidemiologist. This is just an example that I think is illustrative of how important it is that we are all continuing to adhere to the social distancing policies and take them seriously, and really try not to make any exceptions that you don't have to. So as of today, like at the time we record, there are 16,796 cases of coronavirus that have been diagnosed in the United States. So just a skosh under 17,000. People that are smarter than I am estimate that like this virus, like the people number of infected, like it'll double like roughly every 3 days. Okay. Like the doubling time for how many positive cases seems to be about every 3 days. Assuming that the doubling time is about 3 days, and assuming that the folks predicting peak infections in the population will occur in about 6 weeks, that means that the 17,000 infections, 6,796 that we have today, would double 14 times. Do you guys have any idea how many infected people will be in the U.S. if 16,796 infections double 14 times?
45 million.
100 million.
137,592,832.
Wow.
That's
Hundred-
terrifying.
Infected though, right?
That's infected. 137.5 million infections. Now, let's say we all stay home, okay? And we're trying to do this like flatten the curve deal, and nobody like goes out and does stuff. And let's say that means that instead of doubling every 3 days, we buy 24 hours. So now it doubles every 4 days instead, okay? And that would mean that instead of doubling 14 times, it doubles 10 and a half times. All right. You guys have any idea how many times that would reduce? Like what
was the first number?
137.5 million.
So 63, 31.
I'd say probably cut it down by 50 million.
10 million.
It'd be 17,199,000. So you would get rid of 120 million of those 137 million infections.
Wow.
If you can get it to 5 days instead of 4, it's down to about 4 million. That 137 million goes down by 133 million. And if you can get the doubling time to 6 days in 6 weeks, you'd have 1 million infections in the United States. So you would reduce the 137 million potential infections. You would reduce that number by 136 million.
I do think it's important to note that the flatten the curve stuff that's new generally to most of the public does mean that we'll be dealing with the social distancing stuff for longer, right? I do think that that's important to note. So if people are starting to get a little stir crazy or starting to say, next week or even a few days from now, what's the big deal? It seems like maybe the cases aren't that bad, that means it's working. So keep, if you're doing this, if you're staying in your house and trying to keep yourself and your community safe, keep it up.
Yeah, that's right. Stay home. Folks.
Well, one thing that I've also heard is that while now is the peak season, with some cases of the flu, it could go away in the summer. We could have a resurgence in the fall. So this is something that we have to prepare for throughout the year and not just in the next couple of weeks. We really have to be proactive and thinking about how we're going to mitigate.
Right. Well, let's turn our attention away from the disease and back to, I was going to say another disease, but that's mean. Let's look at what's been going on in our state government, because that's really our bailiwick here at Let's Pod This, right? The Oklahoma government. So it's basically shut down at this point. But it's nuts. Last Friday, you could still go to an NBA game. And today, you can barely leave your house, right? That's how quickly things turned around. So on Tuesday, the legislature passed really 2 bills. One to allow some money to be transferred out of the lengthy trial fund that I'm sure most of us didn't even know existed, that they can use it to pay for various things. And then secondly, they made some changes to the state's Open Meeting Act to allow public entities, so literally every board, commission, whatever in the state, like school board, city council, oversight boards, all that stuff, everything that's subject to Open Meeting Act, to allow them to meet virtually, either on the phone or teleconference or video conference like what we're doing. And that process was a little bumpy, I will say, as someone who has a vested interest in that. So what happened was the Senate passed a bill. So they basically took a House Bill 3888, stripped the language out, dumped in a floor substitute. So just put in new language, without going through committee, just straight to the floor, that would expand the Open Meeting Act and allow entities to meet, again, through using technology and a few other things. And then they passed it and sent it to the House just before lunch. And in that process, one of the clauses, right, made this in place for a year, so till March of 2021. And that was a little anxiety provoking because the day before, Speaker McCall had said, listen, we're gonna have special rules and we're gonna suspend some things, but only for the minimum amount of time. Like if this was proposed next year, I would not support it. And so now we got a bill going over that would basically change rules, changes the law for a whole year. As it went to the House, basically during the lunch hour, the House, rather than, because it was a House bill, so if they had amended it and sent it back to the Senate would have had to pass it and then send it back to the House for the final passage. So rather than doing that, the House took an old Senate bill that was hanging out there from last year, again, stripped the language out, dumped in a floor substitute that was the same bill, and sent it back over, changing a few things. And so at the end of the day, what happened was the legislature passed some moderate changes to the Open Meeting Act to allow public entities to meet. The Attorney General reached out to a member of the Oklahoma Press Association and said, hey, like he texted him during all of this debate and said, listen, I'm watching this. We are working on some frequently asked questions. Basically, like, my office will clarify what this law says so that you have some concrete rules by which to go by. And all that got passed, the governor signed it. And ultimately, it's a good thing. But it was like watching legislative gymnastics for about 4 hours. And I was like trying to write blog posts and have a statement about this.
That's my favorite kind of gymnastics.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only kind I can do. Anyway, at the end of the day, it all passed. And honestly, like, I think the way it is now is pretty decent and maybe even a little ahead of where our government would have been without it. Like, at some point, we've got to make some rules and some laws to include virtual meetings because it's 2020 and this is how the world works, right? And so I wonder if in the midst of all the chaos and panic, this outbreak, this pandemic might actually push some aspects of our government forward in a way that is positive overall.
Well, that makes sense because, I mean, the Senate is having to close until March 27th, and it's adding not necessarily confusion, but really pushing the legislature to be innovative and thoughtful about how they're going to meet their constitutional obligation to finish the state budget. And so the legislature is going to need to think going forward how to innovate so when these moments happen, that government can still do what it needs to do.
So the other big thing this week was about Medicaid expansion, right?
Yes.
So as we all know, Governor Stitt has proposed his plan for Medicaid expansion and essentially has expanded Medicaid at this point, right? Full expansion. But he is pursuing a waiver from the federal government that would restrict Medicaid pretty substantially. And he went ahead and filed that, I guess, last week, or was that just on Monday? It's all running together now.
Well, they had public comment on this week, so.
Right, because once they filed that, it started the 30-day public comment period. On Tuesday or Wednesday was the first one of those, and then they have another one today. But they're having to do that public comment virtually because you can't be gathered in groups of 10 or more. And I think that's caused a lot of confusion and a lot of concern, right? That maybe this would inhibit or hamper public comment efforts. What do you guys think?
Confusion and concern, I'll say it. People are freaking pissed because this is a huge deal, right? Like, this is a huge change to one of the most important state programs that we have, and they're proposing it at a time when people's access to healthcare is arguably even more critical than it is generally. Two, they're proposing it at a time where the normal and typical means that people have to address their concerns aren't available to them, right? Three, they're proposing at a time where people probably aren't paying attention because they're more concerned about keeping themselves and their families healthy and safe and not getting sick. And four, a lot of folks, many people are saying that it's not very good policy.
Well, the enrollment's going to be low in the way that it's happened.
This is the thing that like, I am not, but I don't understand how this is going to work because like the statute says, and like Effie and Bailey know more about this than I do, but like the statute says you can't use waivers to do things to Medicaid that make Medicaid like not work as well. It has to be stuff that's going to increase people's acts, like improve people's healthcare and increase, like make their healthcare better, essentially. And the state's own report says that the plan will depress enrollment. Like it's going to kick people off. Like, how do they think this is going to pass like legal muster, even if they can get it through?
Well, and even politically, you know, I think as you said, the timing is either just really clueless and tone deaf, or it's purposefully they're purposefully doing this at a moment when people's attention is directed elsewhere. And, you know, either one of those scenarios is not great, particularly considering the impact that Medicaid has and how many people rely on it and how many people need it. That's a pretty major proposed policy change at a moment when arguably the government should be focusing on other things too.
Well, and it could have potential implications to the country, because if these waivers were to go through and the way that the governor wants to implement Medicaid expansion is accepted, we'll be the first state to ever do it in this way. And so it sets a new precedent that now other states who may have this view of this approach to Medicaid may explore this. So it could affect other people across the country. So this timing, I agree with Effie and Scott that the timing is just not good to push this policy through.
And by the way, Medicaid expansion, straight Medicaid expansion would provide, I mean, it would provide help to citizens all across Oklahoma, but I think it's particularly sorely needed in a lot of our rural towns and counties and municipalities, which are, for a lot of reasons, the places in Oklahoma that, at least right now, are not really taking a lot of precautions in terms of coronavirus, it seems. You know, so like the cases in Oklahoma City, or the cases in Oklahoma right now, are concentrated in Oklahoma County, which is to be expected because this is where most of the people live. But this is going to spread throughout the state. And at least right now, I mean, there's pictures from towns all over more rural parts of the state where people are kind of going about their life, doing their normal thing. And their hospitals have closed, right? Like,
Yeah.
and aren't going to reopen. And, you know, Medicaid expansion is something that could alleviate that. But instead, we're trying to push through this. I mean, the waiver wouldn't take effect until 2021, so it probably doesn't matter for coronavirus. But like, it's just like striking to me. The like you said, Effie, either how tone deaf or deliberately obfuscatory it is.
Well, and I think too that this is a major opportunity for our country to really see what public health is, right? Public health is not private healthcare. It's not the same thing. And so this is I think a hard lesson that I hope we take to heart, that, you know, some of the attitudes about Medicaid, like the work requirements and the thought that, you know, those people are just lazy or whatever all the stereotypes are. Public health doesn't care, right? Community and population health is dependent on all of us being as healthy as possible. And so I hope that another, you know, hopefully good thing that comes from this outbreak is that the public learns that everybody actually does need healthcare, that even if you have private health insurance and you're a healthy person or have a healthy family, the weakest link in your community could bring everybody down, right? So Medicaid is less about the individual to me and more about public health. And I'm hoping that folks are going to take that to heart from this coronavirus outbreak and really start to recognize that we are all connected.
The coronavirus does not have an ideology.
No, it does not. You know, I've told this story to Scott and Andy a few times. The former Surgeon General under President Bush used to be faculty, might still be faculty at the University of Arizona, where I did my master's in public health. And he, at that time, you know, I lived in Tucson, right on the border with Mexico. And he made a great point that, you know, tuberculosis doesn't care what color your skin is, because at that time they were considering doing ICE raids in hospitals. And that was a Republican Surgeon General and a Republican president saying, like, this is terrible policy. We have to protect public health. We can't be rounding people up at hospitals. And, I wish our Surgeon General now would say something as bold as that, but he'd probably get fired. But anyway, that's the lesson, right? That viruses and pathogens like this don't care how you vote or how much money you have. You are still vulnerable.
Much like Michael Scott says in The Office, viruses, like computers, are trying to kill you.
Yes.
Working in an office quote. I love it.
So some other implications about all this is that the state election board, Paul Zirex, declared an election emergency, which is so far my favorite emergency we've had. And
it sounds like something on Parks and Rec.
It does. That's right. I could see Leslie Knope being like, I am declaring an election emergency. That does not mean that we need to have one right away. It means that the elections that are scheduled to be held in April can be rescheduled. This week, there was a presidential primary in Ohio and Nebraska and some other states, and it was just a mess. The Ohio thing was fascinating because the court and the governor and somebody else were going back and forth until they were issuing statements at 10 p.m. and even at 4 a.m. just hours before the polls opened. So I'm glad that that Paul Zirex went ahead and got this out there. Do you guys think that this is going to have any impact on our June in-state primaries?
Well, can you explain more what an election emergency means? Does it give the election board some kind of special power? Are they proposing some changes like mailing everybody their ballots?
Well, so yes. So an election emergency is kind of like a state of emergency where it does give the election board some leeway in how they handle things. And basically they called it to allow school districts, municipalities, everything else to move elections to another date. They wouldn't ordinarily be able to do that. And they said, regular and statutory elections could be rescheduled to June 30th, which is the in-state primary. And that would be convenient for the election board. But we're getting down to the wire here where they're going to have to print ballots too. And so I like that Mr. Zirex said, we are in uncharted waters here. So I'm hopeful that we have found a sensible solution that is consistent with the spirit of the law and avoids bureaucratic overreach by state election officials. That's a tremendous statement.
You always have to get in bureaucratic overreach.
It's the name of my punk band, but no one comes to my shows.
I bet they have a search and replace thing on Word documents for anything in Oklahoma government that's like, if it doesn't say that phrase, sneak it in there.
Just add it. So
unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah,
would be the other way.
That's a Scott Mitchell favorite right there. So I next month April is candidate filing, and they basically, you don't have to be in person to file, and you could get someone to notarize it and mail it in. But as I think everyone is aware, the longer that this pandemic is in place, the more things get questionable as we move towards the presidential election in November. Now, no one on this podcast is suggesting that we reschedule the November election. That is, one, premature, and two, requires congressional approval. And that's a huge deal. I haven't even done research yet to find out when, if ever, that's been done. But that would be an enormous deal. I think what we're looking at is just how do we get from here to there, given the current state of things.
Yeah, and you can see this becoming partisan really quickly if there are proposals to allow everybody to vote absentee. I'm sure we're going to hear lots of panicked calls from the right about voter fraud and things like that. So I'll be interested to see how this plays out in different states as well as at the national level, because elections are pretty important, as we know, and the way that those unfold determines everything. So.
Well, and even how the structures are in place varies from state to state. And so one state could have decent turnout because they have online voting mechanisms, while other states may struggle because they don't have, those different processes in place where people can participate. So it'll be interesting to see what decisions are made to maximize the vote.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting to me is because I've, listened to some other podcasts, and they, we've talked about this question of like, if you were, I think what's probably going to happen is, like not a rescheduling of election, but like making it easier for people to vote, right? Vote by mail, those sorts of things. Like, okay, let's say that we change nothing about the election. Okay, like everything proceeds as is. States conduct elections exactly the way that you do now. There's no expansion of early voting. There's no expansion of vote by mail. It's the same. So who seems to be most vulnerable to the coronavirus?
Old people.
Or elderly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have an election where turnout is dramatically depressed among older folks, what party does that seem like it maybe could benefit?
This is a trap. I'm not taking it.
No, right, like I don't understand.
In theory, people would assume it would.
No, but that's what I'm saying is like, because you're right. Like there would. Right, but what I'm saying though is that like I think you're right. Like the like thing that no one is saying here is that this will turn into a partisan issue because Republicans will say voter fraud and Democrats will say access and like democracy, right? Like that's the fight that we always have about this. But like here the incentives are reversed, right? If there is an election where the turnout is really low among older voters, which skew to the right, that would benefit you would think to benefit Democrats, whereas expanded access, like early voting, vote by mail, that would keep turnout high or at average levels would benefit Republicans. So like this seems like there might actually be the time where you could get like some serious election reform done because the incentives are different than they typically are.
We live in crazy times. Everything's backwards.
Literally everything is affected by this, like in crazy ways, right? Like I have yet to think of a job in America that really is not somehow touched by this. And I think over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see a lot more. So,
well, and it's why policy decisions are so critical to be thoughtful about the larger umbrella of people, because the way that our workforce structure is designed, it doesn't, like, certain mechanisms of unemployment and other things aren't capturing like artists or workers who are paid by tips and those other means. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of the third stimulus bill to make sure that all workers are covered.
So what federal legislation has kind of been, what's been passed and what's being worked on to try and mitigate the economic effects, certainly, of the coronavirus pandemic. So there's been a Families First Coronavirus Response Act. I believe that is what was.
Well, there's one before that, though.
Oh, what was the first one?
So there's been about 2 iterations and a third one that's being worked on. So the first one was the initial appropriation immediately after the president declared the state of emergency. And that was about a $8.3 billion appropriation that was signed into law to get immediate dollars out to states, especially towards testing capacity. So that was on March 6th. And it's really crazy because government never moves fast. And so we're seeing a lot of legislation moving quickly. So the pandemic is making Congress move a little bit faster than what it normally does. So that Families First Coronavirus Response Act was signed into law just a couple of days ago. And it has components of paid leave for businesses that have under 500 employees. It has provisions to bolster unemployment. It has provisions that would increase areas related to nutrition and foods. And then most recently, there's been a lot of conversation about what is the next step. How do we get immediate dollars to communities? And so that's the current stimulus bill that Congress is trying to work through that the Senate proposed yesterday.
So, Bailey, that Families First Coronavirus Relief Act,
Mhm.
seemed like there's a lot of good stuff in there that could be pretty helpful. Do you know offhand how Oklahoma's congressional delegation voted on that bill?
Yes, I do. So on the House side, when it was voted upon, Congressman Cole, Congressman Lucas, and Congresswoman Horn voted yes for the measure. Congressman Mullen did not vote. It's suspected because he has a son who has faced an injury in California. He's been doing visits back and forth to California for that. So he did not vote, but Kevin Hern did vote no against that legislation. When it was voted on Wednesday now, because it's Friday, all my days are running together. Senator Lankford voted against it, and Senator Inhofe voted against it. And so there were 8 senators who voted against it, and both of ours were a part of that, those 8. So
imagine that.
Yep.
Well, and they mentioned that there was concern about the paid leave portions hurting small businesses. And so that was the perspective of the money's not getting immediately down to communities and hurting small businesses that are intended to be helped by the bill. But that's their rationale for the no vote.
It was interesting to watch the fallout from those votes, because Inhofe's office in particular released a press release that sort of made it sound like he supported it. And he got called out very quickly on that he actually supported a different bill that ended up failing and some other amendments, but he did not support the bill that passed. And so it was interesting to watch his office get caught, so to speak.
That's speaking of Inhofe getting caught. So today, I guess this morning, we woke up at like 4:00. I think the front coming through woke up our dogs and the cat and the baby. It was a really bizarre time. But I saw an article for the New York Times about some insider trading, right? So there was, I think, 5 senators, one of which was James Inhofe, that was named as someone who allegedly dumped a bunch of stock just before America really started to realize how big this pandemic was going to be. Another person was Senator William Burr, who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee. And he's yesterday NPR had a story about him giving a talk to a small kind of private group in which his language was much more aggressive about how bad this was going to be than he had been publicly. He'd just authored an op-ed saying, not so bad, it's going to be okay. And then told this group, oh no, it's going to be real gnarly. And in between there, he sold off $1.8 million worth of stock before it tanked.
As one does.
Right. And this is a bipartisan effort, right? Senator Dianne Feinstein was also named as one of them. Although so far she's had the best alibi. I thought Senator Inhofe's statement was just weak. He was like, I wasn't in that meeting. I was in another meeting. And I was like, that's not the fucking point. The point is the stock was sold.
No, he didn't even say that he was in another meeting. He said he was I think in Oklahoma with pro-life students.
I thought I thought it was a meeting with those. Yeah.
So not only was he not
and the
there,
new nominee to be U.S. ambassador to Tanzania is what he said.
Tanzania? Come on.
It's a little bananas. They're all saying that they don't make any of their own investment decisions, and that all of this is done through third parties who manage their assets, and they're in ETFs and index funds and all this stuff. I don't know. It's not a good look.
It's not a good look. Well, and interestingly, a lot of folks are calling for there to be investigations about this insider trading accusations for these senators, and the chair of the Senate Ethics Committee is Senator Lankford. And so, I don't want to project what's going to happen, but I anticipate that this is going to probably not turn into much unless there's a separate investigation outside of the Senate.
Good. Like that. I didn't know that. And like the irony is just
right. The mind boggles.
Yep.
Speaking of, have you guys seen Effie? You probably have not been since you're in Maine, but Andy, Bailey, have you guys seen Senator Inhofe's his opening salvo and his reelection bid and his the commercial of him flying his plane?
Yeah, I saw it during the Super Bowl. If you guys will allow me to continue, he's like, it's all recorded on his like in helmet mic.
Yes, while he's flying his plane and talking about the greatness of America. Doesn't really say anything about what he has done or will do as a senator. It's just him flying his plane that's painted red, white, and blue and talking about America.
Isn't that all it takes anymore?
I mean, that's the thing. I'm sad to say I think it's probably a remarkably effective ad.
Yeah.
Effie, have you seen it?
I have seen it. Yeah. Yes, I've seen
Okay.
I've seen many jokes about it on the interwebs. The thing that baffles me, and I've said this for a long time about lots of legislators, the man is 85. Doesn't he want to like rest and play with his grandkids? Being a senator is hard work. It's grueling. You have to travel a lot. You have to read a lot, I'm sure. It just doesn't, that's not how I'd want to spend my 80s. I'm surprised that the interest among that age group remains as high as it does.
I mean,
he served since the 80s, so he's been there for a long time representing Oklahoma.
I don't have a lot of power, but I've heard it tastes delicious.
Yeah, I could see that. to put in perspective his age, and this is without saying it's a good or bad, but just to clarify how old he truly is. He was born during the Dust Bowl. Like, he was alive during the Dust Bowl, and he still is making decisions for Oklahoma.
But also as a balanced perspective, it would be, I said, as a balanced perspective, it would be a huge loss to Oklahoma should somebody else be elected, because he has one of the most powerful positions in the Senate.
Yeah, he's a very senior senator.
Yeah, well, as the Armed Services chair of the Senate. And so, I mean, it's a double-edged sword.
We talked about this last year, when we had an issue with the way graduate medical education was funded in Oklahoma. The Oklahoma's medical schools were short several $1 million, and it was like a whole big thing. But there was a defense spending, I think, authorization bill, and Senator Inhofe just like inserted a line that was like $30 million for medical education in Oklahoma. And like we talked about it on the show at that time, like I disagree with Senator Inhofe on like any number of things, but let's just say that our senator or one of our senators was a freshman in either party, right? Like they don't get to be like, hey, by the way, we're putting a $30 million appropriation for medical education in my state into this bill. Why? Because I said so. Right.
Well, that's one thing that's been interesting being in Maine is, Senator Collins is in the same position. A lot of people are really unhappy with her, but she's such a high-ranking senator, and she's so powerful and has brought so much to the state that people here, I don't know if folks in Oklahoma are feeling a little bit torn about voting for Inhofe or not, but people here are definitely torn about whether they want to continue to support Susan Collins.
Effie, I don't understand. Why would anyone not want to support Senator Collins?
A lot of people are still pretty upset about her vote on Brett Kavanaugh. And
I forgot all about that.
Yeah, people in Maine are not happy about that. And I'm hearing a lot of ads on the radio and stuff that are really criticizing her for taking so much corporate PAC money from she's taking all this money and it doesn't really help Maine. And I'm not super in tune with what's going on in Maine politics, but Bailey makes a good point that giving up your senior senator, even if you don't agree with them, is a big loss for a state because they wield a lot of power.
I think something that might come home to roost a little bit for Senator Collins. I know nothing about Maine politics except that she's she's the senior senator, and that the other one is Angus King.
Yeah.
And I just know that because I I think I want to name my firstborn son Angus. But
After the beef, not the senator.
Ashley is sitting across the table from me at our makeshift home office, and the look she just gave me. No. But so in 2008, 2009, President Obama, one of his first major acts was to sign an economic recovery package after the 2008 financial crisis. And there was originally supposed to be, I want to say, it was $897 billion in the economic recovery package, specifically earmarked for $897 million, not billion, $897 million, which is a lot of money for pandemic preparedness, like pandemic readiness. That was actually stripped out of the bill at the insistence of Senator Susan Collins. So I don't know if that's going to hurt her this time around.
Maybe. I mean, somebody will need to mention it, you know. I don't know if people know about it.
Two things. One, a quick correction. I think I said William Burr earlier. I meant Richard Burr. Anyway,
I wasn't going to say anything.
Thank you. It's not Aaron Burr, right? That's all we know. Aaron Burr.
So Scott keeps saying that your mom come back. Do you know what my husband has started saying to me lately? Instead of like your mom goes to college or whatever, he he says you're the worst, Burr. That's what he says when he's not happy. You're the worst, Burr.
Little Hamilton nod there.
Yep.
Effie, if we could, as we near the end of the episode here, I would love to quiz you on some aspects of Maine.
Okay.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being
best.
the most, how prepared do you feel for this?
4.
Perfect. Great. Do you know the state bird of Maine?
No, I don't.
The chickadee.
A chickadee. I did know it.
Here's an easy a softball here for the second question. The state crustacean.
Lobster.
Yes, of course. Everyone knows that, I think. The next one you're never going to guess. The state fish is the landlocked Atlantic salmon.
It's very specific.
That is very specific.
It's Atlantic salmon, but not the regular ones. The ones that somehow got stranded on land.
Yeah.
And only those.
I feel like someone should save them.
That sounds very. That sounds very like on brand for Maine.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah. These are our salmon. There are many salmon like them, but this one is ours. The state insect?
The black fly.
No.
I don't know.
The honeybee.
Oh.
This feels like a political.
It's because they not fertilize. They pollinate the blueberries, right?
Probably.
So that brings me to the state food.
Blueberries.
That's part of it. It says blueberry pie, whoopie pie.
Oh.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aren't those two totally different things?
No, it could be a blueberry flavored whoopie pie.
Yeah.
But
That seems like an abomination.
It does sound gross.
A blueberry whoopie pie?
I mean, it could be fine. I don't know.
I had
man.
blueberry beer here once, and it was weird.
I wonder why that's not the state dessert instead of the state food.
It's just state food, right? Yeah. There's other food options. I think they should change it.
I'll tell you what, there's some blueberry gin. They make some blueberry gin in Portland, Maine that'll knock your socks off in the best way possible. It's awesome.
Nice. The state beverage? I've never heard of this before.
Moxie.
Yes.
It's
Tell me about Moxie.
I don't know anything about it. I haven't tried it. It's like a soda brand from a long time ago that is very polarizing. People either love it or hate it. I've not tried it.
We're going to need you to
report
taste
back.
it.
Okay.
Yeah. It says Moxie's flavor is unique, a sweet drink with a bitter aftertaste. It is flavored with gentian root extract, an extremely bitter substance commonly used in herbal medicine.
Gentian, like gentian root? Gentian?
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it. Yeah, gentian.
Oh, you use gentian violet to treat thrush in babies.
Well, okay.
You paint their mouth purple.
Effie, if I Venmo you, can you ship me some Moxie?
I will
during
bring
this
you some Moxie.
quarantine? This
Yes.
sounds fascinating.
I've never even seen it. I don't know. Maybe it's purple.
It's an orange can.
It's an
That's all I
orange
know.
can. I don't know what the drink itself looks like.
But
When I was
but it's a soft drink.
I think so.
Because this sounds like, because you're talking about this, Andy, it makes me think of like Malort, like from Chicago, which is like this like super 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 bitter like liquor that apparently is disgusting. But if you're like hipster enough, you drink it and profess love for it. I don't know.
No, it's a carbonated beverage among the first mass-produced soft drinks. It was created in 1876 as a patent medicine called Moxie nerve food.
Okay.
It was designated as the official soft drink of Maine on May 10th, 2005, and continues to be regionally popular today, particularly in New England,
Well, okay.
which is nuts. So anyway, yes, I would love to taste it. When I was in high school, I worked at Subway. I'm a sandwich artist, as I think our listeners probably know. And the Subway I worked at was in a gas station, like on the edge of town, like one of the weird gas stations, not a major, like not a Texaco. It was like a Quicks, like with an X.
I too worked at a gas station in high school.
It's the weirdest place, right?
Yep.
Like a close-knit community. And we had really weird products that we would often buy with our tip money, like blue cream soda and Tijuana Mama beef jerky, pickled beef jerky sausage things. And I was always really entertained to try these off-the-wall concoctions, much like Moxie. So,
not to disrupt the amazing fun we're having, but Bailey has a little bit of breaking news that she just put in our Slack channel.
mm-hmm.
Oh, so this is related to coronavirus. So bringing us back to the initial conversation on the podcast, there are states that are taking a lot of precautionary measures that are basically forcing people to practice social distancing. So California was the first state to require shelter-in-place policies. The city of San Francisco first did it, and now it's the entire state of California this week that's under a shelter-in-place requirement, meaning that you can go out and get food or for emergencies, but they ask people not to do anything outside of that. Illinois just announced about 30 minutes ago that they're also implementing a shelter-in-place policy. So we're seeing more of those pop up throughout the states as the pandemic progresses.
Illinois, crazy times. So Colorado, New York, Illinois. Is Texas next, do you think? Florida? One of those?
Well, Texas hasn't put any statewide policy yet on even shutting down restaurants and bars and things. So,
all right, folks. Well, that brings us, I think, to the end of this episode. Hey, next week, guys, let's talk about the economic impact of the pandemic, specifically on the Oklahoma budget. That'll give us another week of data, and I have a feeling we're going to have a lot more information that is probably not positive. So we'll do that next week. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Bailey, thank you very much.
of course.
Effie, thank you for joining us from Maine.
Thanks for having me. It was nice to see other humans' faces today.
We should definitely do a Maine focused episode because I think Maine politics is low-key fascinating, and whatever insight you could share would be just lovely.
The only insight I can share is like a compare and contrast with Oklahoma.
That's exactly what we need.
And it
That's
is interesting. It's very different.
I wonder, part of me thinks that they would be kind of similar. Like they have, like, because Oklahoma tends to be, like, we tend to have a lot of, like, get off my lawn, leave me alone.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't care if, like, anybody who wants a medical weed card can get one, but don't tell me that I also can't have, like, a million guns. And it seems like there might be a similar strain running through a lot of Mainers.
There is a similar strain for sure, except for, like, add in a little bit more, like, I make my own organic granola and I sew things out of llama wool.
Sure.
Other than that, there are some similarities. Yes.
That's a very specific fabric.
It's yes.
So we're going to call the episode Surf and Turf because it's the same state, just you have lobster and we have beef.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about it there. That's a great plan.
Great.
We should eat surf and turf while we record.
But only
right, well,
only if you take safety precautions at the grocery store to buy those goods.
I will order it. Is Omaha Steaks, is that still a thing? Are they still shipping it to your door?
Probably.
Who knows?
Never had an Omaha steak. Heard they're tasty.
It's fine. It's steak. It's fine. All right, everyone. Well, don't forget to subscribe and rate Let's Pod This on Apple Podcasts, because that helps other folks discover us. Remember, you can stay connected with us on Twitter and Instagram. Even in the midst of a pandemic, we are at Let's Fix This Okay. Scott is at SC Melson. Bailey is at Bailey M. Perkins. Effie is at... Do you know your Twitter handle?
I recently changed it. Hold on. It's still at Effie Craven.
Effie Craven.
Yeah.
And I am at AndyOKC. You can also like our Facebook page at facebook.com/Let's Fix This Okay, which is our website, letsfixthisok.org. Sign up for some newsletters, which I need to send out. Man, it's been a minute. Read our blog. Need to write one of those as well. And find other resources and details about upcoming events, of which there are none because it's a pandemic and everyone's staying home. If you want to make a donation, that would be terrific. Our podcast is edited and produced by Scott and me and Bailey. And Let's Pod This is a member of the Mostly Harmless Media Network. Our theme music is provided by artist So Down, and it is a track called Rhino Funk. Let's Fix This is a nonpartisan, non-profit organization who strives to educate and equip all Oklahomans to engage with their government. We encourage you to get involved in any way you can, and remember, decisions are made by those who show up. But not right now. Keep a safe social distance, and everyone be safe.